Around 1200 BC, something went wrong. Not in one place, everywhere. Within the space of 50 years, almost every major civilization in the eastern Mediterranean collapsed. The Mycenaean Greeks, the Hittites, the Egyptians lost most of their empire. The great trading cities of the Levant, Ugarit, Megiddo, Hazor, were burned and abandoned and never rebuilt. Entire writing systems disappeared. Technologies were lost. Trade networks that had connected 3 continents for centuries simply stopped. And then silence. Hundreds of years of what archaeologists call a dark age, a period so poorly documented that we barely know what happened or who was even alive. Historians call this the Bronze Age collapse. It is one of the greatest unsolved mysteries in human history. And for a long time, the most popular explanation was simple: invaders. A group of people referred to in Egyptian records as the Sea Peoples swept through the region and destroyed everything. Except that explanation has never fully held up. Because the Sea Peoples did not arrive before the collapse, they arrived during it. Some scholars now believe they were not the cause of the collapse at all. They were refugees fleeing it. Displaced people from collapsing civilizations, moving in desperate waves across the Mediterranean. So if it wasn't the Sea Peoples, what was it? Archaeologist Eric Cline at George Washington University has spent decades studying the Bronze Age collapse. In his 2014 book, 1177 BC, he argues that what destroyed the Bronze Age world was not a single cause. It was the failure of an entire system. The Bronze Age Eastern Mediterranean was, by the standards of its time, a globalized world. The Egyptians traded grain and gold with the Hittites. The Hittites traded iron and horses. The Cypriots supplied copper. The Canaanites moved tin from Afghanistan across thousands of miles of trade routes. The Mycenaean Greeks supplied olive oil and wine. Every civilization depended on every other civilization. The system worked because everyone trusted the network, trusted that ships would arrive, that payments would be honored, that letters would be answered. And the system was maintained by language, not one language, dozens. But across the entire Eastern Mediterranean, there was one language that everyone used for international correspondence. It was not the language of the most powerful empire. It was not Egyptian, though Egypt was dominant. It was Akkadian, a Semitic language from ancient Mesopotamia that had become the diplomatic lingua franca of the ancient world. Kings wrote to kings in Akkadian, merchants negotiated in Akkadian, treaties were written in Akkadian. When the Egyptian pharaoh Akhenaten received letters from foreign rulers, they arrived in Akkadian, written on clay tablets in cuneiform script. The letters have survived. Archaeologists found them in 1887 at a site called Tel El Amarna in Egypt, the archive of a 14th century BC Egyptian pharaoh. The Amarna letters, as they are now called, are 382 clay tablets, representing diplomatic correspondence between Egypt and its neighbors. They are written almost entirely in Akkadian. What they reveal is a world of extraordinary interconnection. Kings addressing each other as brothers, requests for gold, for medicine, for craftsmen, complaints about delayed shipments, marriage negotiations, diplomatic gifts, a web of relationships maintained entirely through written language across hundreds of miles. And then, around 1200 BC, the letters stopped. Not gradually, the correspondence simply ends. Ugarit, one of the greatest trading cities of the ancient world, a place where merchants from Egypt, Cyprus, Anatolia, and the Aegean all met, sent a letter sometime around 1185 BC asking for military help. They were under attack. They needed soldiers. The letter was never sent. It was found still in the kiln where it was being fired for delivery, preserved by the fire that destroyed the city. Ugarit was burned to the ground shortly after. It was never rebuilt. When civilizations began to fall, the trade networks collapsed with them. When the trade networks collapsed, the supply of raw materials stopped. Bronze Age civilization ran on bronze, an alloy of copper and tin that required international trade to produce, because copper and tin are almost never found in the same place. No trade meant no bronze, No bronze meant no tools, no weapons, no agricultural equipment. But the thing that collapsed first, before the cities burned and the trade routes closed, was something more fundamental: the trust. When you cannot send a letter and expect a reply, when ships stop arriving, when the merchants who used to come every season don't come, when the diplomatic relationships that held the system together go quiet, the system starts to fail, not because it has been attacked, but because the people inside it stop believing it will work. Cline describes what happened as a perfect storm. Climate data from tree rings and pollen analysis shows a severe drought across the eastern Mediterranean starting around 1200 BC. A drought that would have hit harvests, created food shortages, driven population movement. At the same time, internal rebellions were flaring in multiple states, and the sea peoples, whatever their origin, were moving. Any one of those things alone might have been survived. The Bronze Age world had survived droughts before. It had survived rebellions and invasions. But this time, everything hit at once, and the system that might have absorbed any single shock was too interconnected to survive multiple simultaneous failures. When Ugarit fell, its scribes and merchants and traders, the people who knew the languages, who maintained the correspondence, who kept the records, died or fled. The knowledge went with them. The linear B script used by the Mycenaean Greeks disappeared completely. No one alive after the collapse could read it. When archaeologist Michael Ventris finally deciphered Linear B in 1952, he was reading a language that had been unreadable for 3,000 years. Akkadian survived longer in isolated pockets, but its role as the international language of the Mediterranean was over. The world that had needed it no longer existed. What replaced it eventually was the Phoenician alphabet, a simpler system that spread through the Mediterranean in the centuries after the collapse and became the ancestor of the Greek alphabet, the Latin alphabet, and most of the writing systems in use today, but that came later. First, there was the silence, hundreds of years in which the complex, interconnected, multilingual world of the Bronze Age was replaced by smaller, more isolated communities trying to remember how to do things that had been taken for granted for centuries: how to build in stone, how to smelt metal, how to keep records. The things that seem permanent, the cities, the trade routes, the languages, the writing systems, were not permanent. They were maintained. They required people and relationships and correspondence and trust. And when those things broke down, everything built on top of them broke down too. We look at the Bronze Age collapse from 3,000 years away and we see ruins. We see burned cities and silent archives and writing systems that no one could read for millennia. What we don't always see is what came before the ruins, a world that thought it was stable, that had been stable more or less for centuries, that had built palaces and ships and international trade networks, and a diplomatic language that connected 3 continents, a world that had every reason to believe it would continue, and then it didn't. The most sophisticated civilization the ancient world had ever produced collapsed not because it was primitive. It collapsed because it was complex, because complexity requires maintenance, because the more interconnected a system is, the more points at which it can fail. The letters stopped, the ships stopped, the languages disappeared, and a dark age lasted 400 years. The next time you send a message and don't get a reply, it probably means nothing. But somewhere in the back of human history, there is a clay tablet in an unfinished kiln in a burning city, and the reply never came.